Hey, Cypher here. Nations are new. I've said that many a time, but every time I do, I'll get someone claiming that the Romans were nationalists, or that England was a nation invented by the Magna Carta. The problem there is that these excuses confuse multiple meanings of nationhood in order to perpetrate a myth. The history profession was founded on this myth-making. It's basically our original sin. You had antiquarians like Edward Gibbon in the case of Rome, or Thomas Babington Macaulay in the case of Britain. But most especially was Leopold von Ranke talking about Germany. All of these historians' singular goal was to define a national character throughout history. The problem is, they were all wrong. Words, just like everything, change over time. What we refer to as nation is not the same as the thing it meant back when the book Law of Nations released in 1760, which was in fact directly cited by the US Constitution a few decades later. They were not referring to the same kind of nation as we do today. This inability to differentiate between senses of the word is purposely built into its later incarnation. So today, let's explore the etymology of the word nation to see where nationalism comes from. Along with me is Mark, who runs a channel devoted to etymology, Alliterative. He's making an episode showing that the word is actually related to a whole bunch of other words, because it turns out nations as we know them are a 19th century invention. Thanks to all my patrons, especially Kevin Butler, for making this happen. Our usage of the word nation actually has more to do with ethnicity and culture than the original term nation. The word comes from Latin meaning birthplace. The same word is the origin of where we get the terms nature and native. By the time it was used by French and English nobility in the 14th century, it meant what societal rank one was born to. Mark actually studies Middle English, so what did that mean by nation back then?
Well, when the word nation first appeared in Middle English in the early 14th century, it meant a people or group of peoples united by birth or ancestry. In other words, a distinct people sharing common descent. And soon afterward, it came to be used in a couple of other senses. In the biblical sense, the heathen nations, the Gentiles, following the use of the Latin plural nationes in the Vulgate Latin translation of the Old Testament, following Hellenistic Greek, ta ethne, and Hebrew goyim, and a particular class of person, such as the nation of women, men's nation, to mean humankind, and even the nation of beasts to refer to the animal kingdom. The political geographical sense didn't develop until later, perhaps as late as the 16th century or later. The first absolutely clear use of nation to refer to a place rather than a group of people, as far as I can see, is in a book about fishing, published in 1653, called The Complete Angler by Isaac Walton. And that use doesn't even necessarily imply a political state, just a region.
Yeah, so that's really complex. Hereditary aristocracy and peasantry were nations in medieval times, but nowadays we just use the word class. The word nation continued to morph throughout the centuries. That book I referenced before from the 1760s has a full name that makes clear the changing terminology. It's subtitled Principles of the Law of Nations Applied to the Conduct and Affairs of Nations and Sovereigns. Yes, sovereignty is what nation referred to by the mid-18th century, and that's where it remained for the next century. But man, was there a lot of change in that time frame. So how did we get to the current definition? As in, a community of people composed of one or more nationalities and possessing a more or less defined territory and government. Well, That's the crux of the problem. Historians and etymologists love to bicker about what exactly is the beginning of nationalities. The consensus position is that it came somewhere between 1789 and 1848, but you'll find people arguing all over the place. On the extremes, you'll find the ones who've never gotten past the old nationalist historians from a century ago saying nations are ancient. Those folks conflate ethnicity and culture with nationality. To the other extreme, there's radicals saying nations don't exist at all. These are the same folks who say that societal structures don't exist, which is true as like a physical thing, but all abstractions are social constructs, which by the measure of language doesn't exist then. So why bother talking about it at all? With those illegitimate interpretations set aside, there is a clear trend in the current sense of the word centered around a book that came out in 1983 called Imagined Communities. The basic idea of Benedict Anderson's book is that print culture and capitalism provided the impetus to create a shared identity. The liberal revolutions that began with the United States and spread throughout the Atlantic world showed a path towards independence, and the drive of the middle classes to overthrow aristocracy utilized that language of independence to proclaim the sovereignty of communities they imagined into being. Though this is the most popular interpretation, it is by no means the only argument. For instance, Anthony Smith, in his Ethnic Origins of Nations, argues that nationalism comes from the long accretion of ethnic patterns and symbols. He says, "The history of nationalism is as much a history of its interlocutors as of the ideology and movement itself." We can go round and round covering all the various theories, so let's focus more on the way culture came to define nationalism. You see, the word culture has its own etymology, with each sense being organic to a particular language it was filtered through. It comes from the same Latin root as cultivate and had that original meaning. Yeah, culture has a lot of senses.
Culture is another word that had a rather different sense initially. It came from the Latin noun cultura, cultivation, care. Also, the figurative sense, care, culture, and honoring, from the verb colere, to till, tend, care for, cultivate. So it was really an agriculture word, meaning first in mid-15th century English, the tilling of land, the act of preparing the earth for crops. By around 1500, the figurative sense, cultivation through education, systematic improvement and refinement of the mind, is attested but not common. And it isn't until 1805 that we see the sense learning and taste, the intellectual side of civilization, and in 1867 the sense collective customs and achievements of a people, a particular form of intellectual development, the predominant sense today.
Thanks. Be sure to check out Alliterative. It's a truly underappreciated channel. So the French form of culture during the Enlightenment is what people mean when they say, "He is a man of culture," as in having enlightened tastes. The next sense to come about is what's important here because Germans romanticize the word Kultur to define in-group and out-groups. This is the form of the word we mean when we say something is authentic, as in excluding things that are inauthentic. And I'll get to how this Kultur movement became nationalism in just a second, but first, the word culture had two other permutations after that. Next came the British usage of the term in the late 19th century. They were basically referring to what we think of as cultural significance, as in what is canonical, like saying Shakespeare is particularly important to British culture. Finally, there's the American usage, built from anthropology around the turn of the century. This is that all-encompassing term you hear about today, like wearing these clothes are part of the culture. And now you know the various senses of the term culture. There's the French, German, British, and American forms of the word. All have a particular meaning. So going back to the Romantic version, or the German version, as in Kultur. So you had Romantic-era philosophers like Johann Gottfried Herder and Wilhelm von Humboldt saying culture had a kind of worldview exclusive to the language one spoke. It was an identity just as much as something that can be cultivated. Like any form of classification or categorization, it was exclusionary. You can't define one group without excluding another. So they were arguing what it meant culturally to be German, and that's where historians come in. Leopold von Ranke is basically the founder of the history profession. He emphasized primary sources and academic rigor. What made him so nationalistic in the first place is somewhat of an original sin of the history profession, because history is by nature a story. I mean, it's in the name. Both history and story actually have the same origin, as in the Greek word for inquiry. So Ranke's emphasis on narrative meant that he needed a character for that history. Much like Gibbon had given a character to the Roman Empire before him, Ranke gave a triumphal character to a more recent empire, Prussia. In 1824, he wrote Histories of the Romanic and Germanic Peoples, basically making a unified German people under Prussia the triumphal endpoint of that story. And he'd continue that narrative bent for the rest of his career. The Prussian government liked his work so much that they paid him to create a political history journal in 1832. Yeah, this was a state-funded project. And so history was founded on nationalism. The basic idea was to use history to study the character of a nation, which was inevitably triumphalist. By telling the story of a particular people, these historians legitimize calls for independence by claiming one kind of people were always unique and separate. They applied modern definitions backwards and denied cultural synchronicity. Essentially, they took that idea of Kultur and combined it with calls for political sovereignty to create imaginary nations. With all this theory in the background, it was finally to put it in practice and forge the nations these historians claimed were already extant. 1848 was the spring of nations, which I've already done an episode on. To put it simply, numerous people wanted to form nations in a series of revolutions throughout Europe. It even spread to places like China and the United States. The nation-state arose. Nationalistic history stepped into high gear after 1848. Everyone wanted to define what their nation was by examining its historic character. In the US, ours was ultimately defined by Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis. That's the theory stating that westward expansion proved American exceptionalism, tamed savage lands, and created a new civilization. That's why westerns and cowboy stuff was so popular for so long. It's kind of our national myth, which informs our very identity. But realizing the problems of nationalistic history eventually matured the history profession. There's no such thing as a uniquely nationalistic identity that can be projected back to ancient times. That simply doesn't exist. People did not identify with their nation in that way. Nation began as merely one's birthplace, became a form of class identity, eventually simply meant sovereignty, and that sovereignty recombined with people once again to make national characters. What we call nations today did not exist in 1800. They were fabricated into being by philosophers and historians, molded by culture and ethnicity, and eventually formed into states. It was a kind of Hegelian dialectic, as in first there was sovereignty, and then Kultur, and slam them together and you get nationalism. The thing about Hegel is he's often used as a kind of arch-nationalist philosopher, but that couldn't be further from the truth. He celebrated the Enlightenment definition of culture. He even hoped that the French would spread cosmopolitan ideas throughout the world. In 1807, he said, "There is no better proof than the events occurring before our eyes that culture is triumphant over barbarism, and the intellect over spiritless minds." While he thought Europeans were a kind of nation, he didn't believe in a German nation. You see, nationalism necessarily requires that exclusionary Kultur idea. So much is wrapped up in that idea, such as masculinity and femininity. You see, a national character resides in the manliness of its men and the beauty of its women, thereby diminishing anyone outside that national construct as weak and infantilized. These imaginary characters form the identity and societal strictures of what it meant to be part of a particular nationality. Modern masculinity requires the defense of a nation, and modern femininity requires nurturing of it. That's how people define themselves. So I'm sure there'll be a bunch of chauvinists in the comments trying to defend the falsehoods that prop up nationalism today. We cannot so easily untangle nationalism from the present. It's a 19th century invention, and a more powerful one than even electrification. And it comes with that baggage of exclusion. Nationalism is necessarily exclusive, and all the problems that we have saying that people are not American, or people are not truly German, or people are not truly British, all relates back to nationalism. It is that exclusionary ideal saying that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are only the true Americans. Now remember, nationalism began as a means of unifying people for liberation. Germany did not unify until 1871, but many Germans were left out of Germany. Austria is still a separate country, and others didn't want to be controlled by Prussians. My great-great-grandfather, Joseph Young, fled from Alsace-Lorraine to the United States because of the Franco-Prussian War. The nation which liberates itself is always limited to what it can include, but it inevitably also excludes. Especially once a nation-state is already established, nationalism is necessarily bigoted against those it defines as outsiders. That's why so much bloodshed over the last century and a half is rooted in nationalism. You start off defining people as not part of a nation, then say they occupy territory that's yours, and eventually claim that those people need to be removed by any means necessary. So many wars and genocides came from nationalism. Now there's this common idea of civic nationalism, as in defining a nation by its ideals, removes the very thing that makes it a nation, as in its people. So that's a farce. As soon as civic nationalists apply their ideals to people, anyone outside that parameter gets excluded, regardless of their citizenship. Pride in one's country is not the same as defining its people and mandating patriotism, which is what nationalism does. But Hegel actually shows an answer to the delusion of nationalism: cosmopolitanism. Instead of defining in-groups and out-groups as in who's truly part of this nation or that nation, we should instead see national boundaries as unnecessary limitations on a global culture, one in which we all participate in. For as Diogenes said, I am a citizen of the cosmos. Showed a path toward independence. Oh, God damn it! Got something to say? All hail King Richard I, who has gotten into the bathroom and gotten somewhat wet. He's like, unhand me, peasant. Thank you. Oh, that's a good boy. Yeah. Don't rub the camera. King, stop. King. You're being a nuisance. You know what? You're being a nuisance. Well, since you're in the frame, let's just do this real quick. Well, thank you. Hey. Whoa. Whoa. You can see this... King, stop it. No. Meow. Philosophers as Johann... Come on. Ich spreche Deutsch ein bisschen. Gottverdammt! Philosophers such as Johann Gottfried Herder sich verpissen. China and the United States. I'm from the States. Got more Foucault than I can shake a stick at, and somehow I only have one Hegel book. Probably because Hegel sucks. He is like the worst philosopher to read.